The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town or rural port, which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days, by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it, for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquillity. I recollect that, when a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I had wandered into it at noontime, when all nature is peculiarly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat whither I might steal from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighbouring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvellous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighbourhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favourite scene of her gambols. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region, and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk, hurrying along in the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning this spectre, allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows, and the spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure, in a little time, to inhale the witching influence of the air, and begin to grow imaginative to dream dreams, and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there embosomed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making continual changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, or slowly revolving in their mimic harbour, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In this byplace of nature there abode in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy wight of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or, as he expressed it, tarried, in Sleepy Hollow, for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as for the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours, by a withe twisted in the handle of the door and stakes set against the window shutters, so that though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment in getting out, an idea most probably borrowed by the architect, Jost van Houten, from the mystery of an eel-pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by, and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices, conning over their lessons, might be heard in a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, in the tone of menace or command, or, peradventure, by the appalling sound of the birch, as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. He was, indeed, an object of fun, but by no means of dislike among the children, some of whom, indeed, stood in awe of him, and the older folks thought him a kind of idle, good-for-nothing, but harmless being. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labours of their farms, helped to make hay, mended fences, took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all the dominant dignity and absolute sway with which he lauded it in his little empire, the school, and became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favour in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and like the lion bold, which whilom so magnanimously the lamb did hold, he would sit with a child on one knee and rock a cradle with his foot for whole hours together. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighbourhood, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folks in psalmody. It was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to take his station in front of the church gallery, with a band of chosen singers, where, in his own mind, he completely carried away the palm from the parson. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above all the rest of the congregation, and there are peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church, and which may even be heard half a mile off, quite to the opposite side of the mill-pond, on a still Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by divers little makeshifts, in that ingenious way which is commonly denominated by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought, by all who understood nothing of the labour of headwork, to have a wonderfully easy life of it. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighbourhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage, of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and, indeed, inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, was apt to occasion some little stir at the tea-table of a farmhouse, and the addition of a supernumerary dish of cakes, or sweetmeats, or peradventure the parade of a silver teapot. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he would figure among them in the churchyard, between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all the epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering, with a whole bevy of them, along the banks of the adjacent mill-pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. From his half-itinerant life, also, he was a kind of travelling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, a perfect master of all the legendary lore of the neighbourhood, and the visionary propensity I have mentioned before was not a little increased by this habit of poring over Cotton Mather's marvellous volumes. His head was full of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields and haunted brooks and haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman, about whom he had read many dismal stories, which had been related by the country firesides. But if there was a pleasure dearer to his heart than all this, it was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives, as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and sputtering along the hearth, and listen to their marvellous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields and haunted brooks and haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman. But all these were nothing to Ichabod's true ambition. He had laid his eyes upon Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed, not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. She was, withal, a little of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as most suited to set off her charms. Her short petticoat revealed the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round, and was bright with the most dazzling buckles. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favour in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. A spacious farmhouse, with high-ridged but lowly sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers, the projecting eaves forming a piazza in front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this were hung flails, harness, various utensils of husbandry, and nets for fishing in the neighbouring river. Benches were built along the sides for summer use, and a great spinning wheel at one end, and a churn at the other, showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From the piazza one might behold the rich fields of wheat, rye, buckwheat, and Indian corn, and the orchard bursting with ruddy fruit, and the meadowland replete with fat meadow cattle, the sheep grazing on the soft, rich upland slope, the sleek, unwieldy porkers burrowing in the orchard beneath the trees, and, in the distance, a productive woodland, with the blue mountains of the Hudson swelling up to the sky. Ichabod Crane, delighted with his new acquaintance, was soon a frequent visitor at the Van Tassel mansion. He found in Katrina a mixture of glee and coquetry that pleased him beyond measure, and she, on her part, was not insensible to the admiration of the lanky pedagogue. Yet Ichabod had rivals, none more formidable than Abraham Brom van Brunt, generally called Brom Bones, a burly, boisterous young fellow, the hero of all the sports of the neighbourhood, and a notorious wag. Brom was as opposite in person and habits to Ichabod as light is to darkness. Broad-shouldered, strong-limbed, rough-featured, and loud-voiced, with a keen sense of humour and a love of practical joking. Brom had long sought the hand of Katrina, but he found in Ichabod an awkward but earnest competitor. He was the terror of the young folks in the hollow, for his feats of daring on horseback were the talk of the countryside. He delighted in chasing the boys of the village with his raw strength and rollicking spirit, and could shoot, wrestle, and leap with all the energy of a country-born athlete. He was known to pull stunts that frightened all the neighbourhood, from leaping fences to dragging cats up trees, but his audacity and humour won universal admiration. At the Harvest Home Festival, an annual gathering of the country folk, Ichabod and Brom's rivalry came to a head. The great hall of the Van Tassel farm was decorated with autumnal fruits, roasted corn, and glowing lights. Farmers, their wives, daughters, and sons gathered to eat, dance, and recount stories of the year's toil. Ichabod, suave and attentive, did his utmost to charm Katrina, offering compliments, reciting verses, and occasionally strumming his flute for the amusement of the assembled company. Brom Bones, seeing this, was provoked but undeterred. He played pranks, such as startling Ichabod with sudden noises and trying to intimidate him with rough jokes, all of which the schoolmaster endured with nervous politeness. Still, Ichabod's awkward attempts to appear gallant were undercut by Brom's bold, natural presence, and the villagers whispered at the contrast between the lanky, fussy teacher and the robust, daring youth. The evening advanced. After supper, the young people began to dance. Ichabod tried to keep close to Katrina, attending her every step in the country dances, while Brom joined another set, exchanging glances of mischief and jealousy with his rival. Stories and songs were recited around the fire, some of them tinged with supernatural horror, and it was during one of these tales that Ichabod's imagination, already inflamed by his reading of ghost stories and his own nervous disposition, became fully engrossed. The tale of the headless horseman, in particular, fascinated him. It was told by a local dame, with pauses and gestures that made the story seem almost real. Ichabod's eyes would grow wide, and he would listen with bated breath. He thought he saw shadows move in the corners of the room, and the wind outside seemed to sigh along with the story. After the dancing, the company dispersed to their homes, some walking, others riding. Ichabod, thinking to accompany Katrina part of the way, offered to see her safely home. She accepted, smiling graciously. Brom watched from afar, his plans and jests brewing, determined to remind the schoolmaster that Sleepy Hollow belonged to men of brawn and audacity. The rivalry between Ichabod and Brom, fueled by Katrina's presence, continued to intensify. Stories of tricks, pranks, and ghostly tales spread throughout the valley, creating a tense mix of humour and suspense, which set the stage for the famous ride that would decide Ichabod's fate. As the evening drew on, Ichabod prepared to leave the Van Tassel mansion. He had partaken of supper, danced with Katrina, and listened with nervous interest to tales of ghosts and goblins, but now the hour had come for him to ride home. He mounted his lean old horse, Gunpowder, a creature of questionable courage, and set out along the lonely road that led through the hollow. The night was dark, and a chill wind swept through the trees. Ichabod, who had been prone to nervous imaginings, soon found his thoughts haunted by the stories he had heard, particularly that of the headless horseman. He tried to whistle to reassure himself, but the sound caught in his throat, and the shadows of the trees seemed to twist and sway in ghostly forms. As he approached the bridge near the churchyard, the very spot said to be the haunt of the Hessian spectre, Ichabod's imagination got the better of him. Every rustle of leaves, every sigh of the wind seemed to presage some apparition. He tried to spur Gunpowder to a brisk pace, but the old horse shied and stumbled at the sight of a large, dark object among the tombstones. Suddenly, Ichabod perceived a figure on horseback rising in the road behind him. The rider was enormous, his horse fierce and black. Ichabod's heart sank as he realized the figure had no head. The headless horseman was in pursuit. Ichabod whipped Gunpowder, who galloped madly through the hollow. The wind howled in the trees, and the sound of the pursuing horse's hooves seemed to shake the earth. Ichabod dared not look back, yet he felt the spectral presence drawing ever nearer. He spurred Gunpowder with all his strength, racing toward the bridge. Tradition held that the horseman could not cross the bridge, so Ichabod urged the weary horse onward. The gap between him and the ghost seemed to narrow with every jump and turn. At last, with one mighty leap, Gunpowder cleared the bridge. Ichabod felt a sudden, crushing blow. Something heavy and dark struck him. He was thrown from the saddle, sprawling across the road. Gunpowder galloped on alone, leaving him behind. When the townspeople came to search the next morning, Ichabod had vanished. Only his hat was found, crushed, and a shattered pumpkin lay near the bridge. Some said he had been spirited away by supernatural forces. Others whispered that Brom Bones, jealous and mischievous, had played a trick, using the guise of the headless horseman to scare Ichabod out of Sleepy Hollow. Katrina Van Tassel soon married Brom Bones, and Ichabod was never seen again in the neighbourhood. Yet the story of the headless horseman lived on, and travellers along the hollow would sometimes hear the sound of a distant galloping horse, followed by a hollow, eerie laugh. It was said to be the spectre riding in quest of his lost head, or perhaps the ghost of Ichabod Crane himself, still fleeing through the night. Thus ended the tale of Ichabod Crane, the schoolmaster of Sleepy Hollow, who sought love and learning, but fell victim to fear, superstition, and the mysterious, restless spirits of the hollow.